Well, hello and welcome to the Untold Radio Network. My name's Jay Katz, and this is my beautiful wife, Aspasia, and we're joined today by an incredible director, an artist, a musician, the one and only Brendan Young.
Hi there, guys. It's lovely to be on this podcast. Yes, we've got a lot to talk about today, haven't we?
We do.
I tell you, we have got a lot to talk about. Before we start, I should mention that we are in Sydney, Australia. We're actually on stolen land, part of the Gadigal clan,
People
the
of the Eora Nation.
Yes, and we always have to pay respects there. Incredible. They lived in harmony with the land.
I think I'm in stolen land down south, and it's called Naarm. Naarm is
right.
In Melbourne.
Well, I think the only way we're actually going to bring harmony back to the world is we actually give this land, and next time we'll be operating like John Peel did in the initial outside the 5 mile limit, floating on some sort of platform somewhere. But in the meantime, let's give our national and international audience a bit of an awareness about you. And I'll ask you in just a moment to tell us about yourself and your creative career. We met in the late 90s in Sydney.
No.
96.
96.
Yeah.
Well, mid.
Mid. Well, say it's
mid-90s. Yeah, okay.
His wife, always correcting her husband.
Okay.
Anyway, in the mid-90s in Sydney, based around a television pilot special that came out of Oracle Pictures, is that right? And Mystery Clock Cinema, which Mystery Clock is actually the production company of Alex Proyas that gave the world The Crow, AI, so many astounding films, and The Gods of Egypt, one of our favorites.
Gods of Egypt.
But apart from that, we just formed a bond instantly. And today, what we're going to look at is that production of that extraordinary pilot that I believe was way beyond its time. And really, when you look at television today, it was called Conspiracy, and it's been stolen, it's been mimicked, it's been plagiarized, but it was bootlegged, and it is a profound pilot for an incredible series that had so much potential, and unfortunately at the time was not delivered very well to the market. But what Brendan's going to do for us, something that is very rare in the world of anomalous research and ufology, and that is pull back the curtain.
Ah, yes, the curtain.
Because we did the first Australian interview with the infamous Bob Lazar and many other characters that appear as incredible names on the historical path of 20th and 21st century ufology.
As part of the rich tapestry of ufology.
Ufology, mister.
Ufology.
Yes, and it is part of that rich tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we were speaking to the extraordinary author...
Can I just quickly, you said it's been stolen and bootlegged and blah, blah, blah. Is there anywhere that you can actually see it at the moment?
Well, yeah. I mean, I house a copy on my Vimeo page.
Okay.
So,
well, we'll get to that at the very end, shall we?
All right.
Leave that as a surprise.
We'll set up a link for that as well.
Okay, great.
Brilliant. And we do happen to have it bootlegged ourselves on Patreon, don't we?
Oh, yeah, we do.
And so our Patreon.
That's right. That's where you can see it.
Yep.
God.
But, we were speaking with Robbie Graham about every decade since Kenneth Arnold's sightings, that there has been a moment in culture where we thought maybe the cloak will be lifted here. Mm-hmm. And it's updated itself.
Yes,
now,
absolutely.
In 1989, out of Las Vegas, thanks to George Knapp, Bob, no, just wait. I'm just trying to lay this down.
Okay.
You've got so many images, you're overexcited.
If I don't use all the images, I'm going to be upset because it took me ages to upload them. But anyway, let's go.
All right, this is like a Morecambe and Wise episode here at the beginning.
Which one are you, Morecambe and Wise?
And Miss Steph, it's perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. I appreciate it. And the other thing I should state is our relationship became so strong that this man was the best man at our wedding.
Absolutely.
So
he was.
What an astounding moment in time that was for both of us to actually find this kindred spirit. But anyway, in 1989, out of Las Vegas, thanks to George Knapp, Bob Lazar first appeared as a shadowy figure on Class TV by the name of Dennis and revealed what was to be one of the most mammoth stories that still resonates three decades later And no matter what people think about the Bob Lazar story, he's remained pretty consistent, which is if you're practicing to deceive,
Mm.
is a difficult thing to do. So where Bob Lazar just sits, we don't know. But what we're going to do, we're going to approach this documentary from a linear fashion in the way it was delivered on TV. So we will look at a few other interesting characters before we get to Bob. But you're a very interesting character, Brendan, and you actually pioneered Australian cult cinema in a way that very few people ever got to do. You appeared in Mad Max as an adolescent. So there you are now with a beautiful crop of black hair.
Oh, yes, the hair with the purple T-shirt. Purple T-shirt was mine, by the way. I brought it to the shoot, and George Miller, Dr. George Miller, where
Mhm.
said, "Oh, look, yeah, that looks right. Go and stand in and do the shot." And they,
Yeah. So what was your line there, Brendan?
oh God, but I have to get the helium voice to match.
All right. Okay.
So if you can imagine a helium voice, I was 12 years old when I did that, so I wasn't exactly my voice hadn't broken. It
Mhm.
was, "Hey, Mister, what happened to the car?" Referring to the smashed up Cadillac behind us. And
Wasn't that called the Interceptor?
no, that car there was a young couple that were in a
Oh, right.
town,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and this is on the front lawn of the Halls of Justice, which in fact is the old pump power station, Spotswood, here in Melbourne. But then I forget the name of the actor, but he played Bubba Zanetti, and he said, "What do you think happened?" And I said this infamous line that was fed to me literally moments through the feds by Dr. George, because this was an unscripted scene, by the way. And
Wow.
so I said, "Oh, it looks like it was chewed up and spat out." And then Bubba Zanetti says, "Maybe it was an act of anxiety." And I pull this kind of face or expression that looks like a bucket of smashed crabs. And George Miller said, "Cut." And I went off and did a few more scenes in that sequence, mainly just reaction things and stuff. But what
Mhm.
was the amazing thing about that being involved in Mad Max was, so I was a young kid obsessed with filmmaking. I was making films on Super 8. I was making films with my friends at school, all genre films, westerns, detective films. I always say start with the classics. And I had heard, basically, my father lived next door to the producer of Mad Max, Byron Kennedy.
Right. Who
And
was actually an amazing
oh,
activist,
Mm.
and how
Yeah.
he produced was astounding.
yeah, I know that's a whole other story. But just simply put, imagine uh, Byron's dad, Eric, and my father, Ronnie, are both watering the lawn, and it's like, "G'day, how are you?" You've got to imagine this is Australian parlance here.
Uh-huh.
"G'day, how are you, Eric?" "G'day, Ronnie." Chit-chatting, and then they're talking about sons, and Eric says, "Yeah, but my son's about to do a film." And the film is it's a sort of a biker picture, I don't
Yeah.
know. And then my father says my son is also into film, and he's doing a gangster film, and I was about 11 years old or 12 years old at the time, and so I was a bit different. Anyway, they arranged for the sons to meet, and that's what happened. I went around to the Byron's parents' house when he turned up with a 16mm scope print of Dirty Harry to project on his parents' lounge room wall as kind of preparation for Mad Max.
Right.
And I walked up with my Baines skateboard under my arm, and I said, "Oh, hi, you must be Byron. My name's Brendan, and I'm really into film too." I mean, like, please. I mean, how embarrassing. Anyway, he laughed and he said, "Look, do you want to come in and we're watching a film tonight?" And so I had to get the permission from my mother because, as we remember, Dirty Harry was an R-rated film down here in
Mhm.
Australia. Um, and that formed a relationship. So I was regularly dropping in on Byron, and he became almost like a kind of amazing film tutor. He would quiz me about tracking shots, dolly shots. He actually gave me.
Sounds like a bit of a mentor.
He was my very first real mentor, an incredible mentor at that, because I got the shooting script of Mad Max to read, and on the way to school, I was reading it every day, and then he'd ask me, a week later, what did I think, and yada yada yada. Anyway, They came to
For
be
those,
casting.
can I just say, for those in the States, Mad Max is the Road Warrior.
That's
That's
right.
what it
It's
was
actually-
renamed in.
No, it was the Mad Max, and then Mad Max 2 was Road Warrior.
Oh, really?
Mad
But
Max
in the
is the
States, wasn't it known as the
No,
Road?
Mad Max
Oh.
was released by AIP and dubbed into American, remember?
Right,
Well,
yeah.
that's
I
right.
was
They
dubbed.
took-
Some guy dubbed me. I mean, I'd love to hear my voice sometime, you know?
Did he do a good job of dubbing you in an American accent?
Oh, he missed the nuances. I just felt like he was very generic, and I've always
Alright.
felt ripped off. But cut a long story short, they were looking for casting some juvenile performers, and then Byron obviously knew at the time I was making films with my friends, and I had a dear friend that I'm still a dear friend, and he was my Robbie De Niro, my actor, Paul Bongiovanni, and I said, Paul, you've got to come and audition for this film. It's going to be incredible. Anyway, for some reason, he chickened out, and I went back empty-handed. And by that time, I'd met George Miller, and he said, Brendan, you seem like a lively chap. Why don't you come to the audition? And I went, me? No, I'm not an actor. I'm a director, you know.
At 12.
Well, totally, you know. I mean, oh
Yeah.
God. So I go and I do the audition. What was interesting is the audition was for a scene that was dropped from the film. But I remember my audition lines, and the thing about Mad Max, the actual writing style of it was like 50s beat poetry. It had a kind of
Kerouac feel.
Kerouac feel, and I can tell you, my lines were: I'm in a pinball parlor, and I'm with some other street urchin, and Jim Goose, we see in the film, goes to a nightclub, and he sees this, you know, this wonderful, sexy disco singer. That's in the film, but what the scene they were intending to shoot is that he leaves with her, and at a pinball parlor, I'm watching Goose stumble with this sexy blonde, and I literally stop and I look at her and I go, quote, va va voom. God, check her out, you know. Now, I decided to drop that scene. And when I rocked up to do the shoot on the scheduled day, it was this scene at the Halls of Justice. And literally there was no script for that actual dialogue. And so Dr. George just fed me some scribbled notes through the fence and shot 2 takes and, you know, how's your father?
And that was it.
Away you go.
But I
Now-
actually ended up being on the film for many, many, many weeks. I wagged school, cut school, in the international parlance. And I did lots of little jobs on that film, like carry camera batteries. I held up the motorcycle visors in the close-ups of toe cutter and so forth, because that was shot on a domestic trailer being pulled down some road in the back of Little River. And I even, at one point, I pushed the eyeballs of, I think it was the Night Rider's eyeballs pop out for over about half a second. And I think because I had little hands, it could fit up into on the spring device. It was eyeballs on a wooden spring. And these were pickups that were done many, many, many months after the initial shoot. So I had a whole education from beginning of script right to the premiere of that movie. So it was an amazing experience for a young person like myself who was in love with filmmaking.
That is phenomenal, and that's what you went to do. You went on to study film at the Australian Film and Television School, and then you started doing film clips. You did your own short independent films, one of them based on the incredible trilogy. I think there were 4 films, weren't there, in the end, by Margheriti out of Italy, Wild Planet. You did a sort of...
Wow.
Was it a homage to that? Or
No, it was inspired by it, but it was not any direct reference other than the title, which was Wild Planet. But it was a futuristic sci-fi chase film with a broad strokes of comedy, and it was something unusual at the film school at the time, because most fellow students were not dealing with genre. Genre was a dirty word at the film school at the time, and I was seen as doing something that was facile, cartoony, ridiculous, and it was all those things to a degree. But I was only 21 years old.
I tell you what, in retrospect, it's a remarkable piece of work, and I'm going to fast track here because all of us here can digress badly.
Yeah.
And there's an incredible history prior to actually coming to doing this pilot. But what I want to ask you, when you were approached to do this pilot, who approached you, And did you have any peripheral interest in the world of the anomalous, the conspiratorial, or the ufological?
Okay, so I was approached by fellow ex-film school students, Victor Gentili and Robert Reynolds, and they headed up a very small boutique company, production company called Oracle Pictures. Now, I'd also, part of that package, and you mentioned that in intro, it was also produced by Mystery Clock Cinema. Mystery Clock Cinema was a company set up by Alex Proyas. Now, Alex Proyas is a very well-known genre filmmaker, as we know. And I left film school to go work at his company, which was then a very successful film production company, specializing in commercials, music videos, and making films. And so I kind of left my film school to go to another film school. So I actually worked for Alex. I wrote 2 feature scripts for him. I worked as a cinematographer for him, plus directing stuff via his company. So later on, when they came to do Conspiracy, I think it was Victor Gentili's idea to do Conspiracy as a 13-part series. And he interested Alex and Andrew Mason. Andrew Mason was, for a time, and Alex's producer. Andrew went on to do The Matrix, another.
He produced The Matrix, yeah.
So they're obviously very interested in it, and they approached me because, look, I mean, I have an interest in genre, and obviously that covers everything from science fiction through to horror, through to anything. But I think, in terms of my interest in the anomalous, look, I wouldn't say I was particularly driven to pursue anomalous issues, although, like anyone, particularly when I was a younger person, I was completely obsessed with ufology and encounters, and and as you do amongst your friends and family, you're often discussing, has anyone had encounters? And when it was like with my cousins, when we were about like 9 or 10, we'd be talking about things that happened or things they had seen, and that goes for things such as, I mean, outside of ufology and all that, also things like ghost sightings and things like that. So yeah, I was quite, as a young person, quite turned on by that. And but I think by the time I was in my 20s and I was a burgeoning filmmaker trying to make my way through get into a career happening, I wouldn't say that was like my top priority in terms of my focus. However, when they presented the idea, now it was essentially for mainstream broadcast television, a 1-hour show which would explore, say, 3 to 4 topics of global conspiracies. And the idea was to take a pretty centrist view, so you would allow a little bit of skepticism, you allow a lot of the acolytes to talk as well. But as we got further into it, and this is the interest for me, it was actually really motivated when I met you, Jamie, because you were introduced to me as the researcher to this project, and I'd never met you before. And Victor said, "Look, Jamie's been hired as our researcher. He's a font of information on conspiracies and anomalous stuff." And I went, "Okay." So, and just sitting down talking to you, I mean, I just got this, a kind of overloaded tsunami of information that was wild. And then I guess what I thought was, and I talked to Victor about this, he was the writer and executive producer of the show, co-producer of the show, and we both felt like what we should do is try and make it quite an intense televisual experience. Let's not hold back. Let's take the kind of we'll call the confrontation
exploitation route.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't exploitative.
No, but
I don't
sensational, maybe. So, put in all the sensational bits and pieces.
I don't know about that either, because in a way, if you look at the Bob Lazar, I don't think that's sensational. I think
none of it's sensational.
Yeah.
What we were doing was possibly, I think, what you might be saying there, Aspas, is we were getting what had become sensational stories in the world of conspiracy, parapolitics, all that.
And so what was interesting, how this show got up, was Channel 10, a major network here in Australia, was having huge success with the X-Files as a show.
Yeah.
And so suddenly they became interested in anything that kind of stepped into that territory. So when it was pitched to them as a 13-part series, they were very keen, and they knew that they could program it on the back of, say, an X-Files episode or something and run it that way. So initially, there was a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm for it. However, the budget didn't express the enthusiasm.
The budget
The
was a
budget
nightmare.
never does.
It was a
It
nightmare.
was a shocking night. It was a shocking budget, Jamie. And I remember, let me quote it. For an hour of television, I think we had at our disposal about $75,000, which is
Wow.
about 50,000 US, which is nothing
Absolutely
to do
nothing.
an hour of mainstream broadcast television, primetime television, I should say. And
I lost half of my library first editions through this to God knows where, because they're all taken to the office of Oracle Pictures. And I think over the course of a year and a half, well, I'm not even going to say what I got.
Go
I
on.
wouldn't have done the grocery
I
bill.
think you got $1,000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
That's
I
what I
had to
remember.
get blood out of a stone.
Yeah.
I think, excuse me for interrupting. It'd be really interesting to tell people about a little bit about Robert Reynolds' career, because Robert was hilarious. And the fact that he had worked on the William Shatner directed Star Trek movie, is that right?
I think so. For my memory, Rob was at film school with me, and he was doing what was known as the production producers course. And one thing he organised, which was pretty good, was a kind of what was it? I suppose it was an internship to Paramount Pictures. So when he graduated, he went straight from graduation. Pretty much within 6 months, he was in Los Angeles at Paramount. And what was amazing was that part of being an intern at Paramount was he was exposed to lots of high-end productions, such as the Star Trek production you're mentioning. But Rob was kind of trying to be a bit of a hustler, and while he was there, he wrote to me and he said, "Look, Brendan, I've screened a 16mm print of your graduation film, Wild Planet, the sci-fi film we were talking about." And he said, "Look, do you want to turn that into a feature film? Because I've got connections now. I'm an intern, you know." And but I said to him, no. What I'd like to do, I'd actually like to, I like to license Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires for a remake. Can you, through your connections, chase through? And I said I wanted to do as a contemporary adaptation, but shot in a retro style. In fact, I wanted to do it in black and white. And
what a brilliant idea!
And so we were actually pursuing that idea with Robert, and Robert found the original rights holders, and we were actually kind of negotiating, but none of it. I mean, I was kicking around fresh out of film school, trying to just earn a living shooting things for other people, or trying to direct music videos or whatever. And I just didn't have the money to pay for the rights. But anyway, Rob had all those experiences at a reasonably high level, but he came back to Australia, and we couldn't get the money for the Bava remake. And I mean, it's sort of like one of those fantasy things. You imagine, if I did that, what would have happened? I had no idea.
You've got to put the feelers out there. One of the funniest things I remember is that he had to read William Shatner and some other producers the dreadful reviews of that motion picture.
That's true. You're right. You're right.
And I think that's what cracked him and sent him flying back to Australian shores.
That's right.
This conspiracy was 97, 96. So we were pre-internet days.
Way pre-internet.
And we had to do astounding things like cold call a lot of the interviewees. And I can remember Victor saying to me, I said, "Oh, this is a bit scary." And Robert was really actually getting really worried that, they were going to bomb his house late at night with some of the people we were wanting to get on the show. And I remember Victor saying, "Jamie, don't worry. It doesn't matter who the person is or the situation, because 99.9% of individuals will run towards the camera, whether they should or not." Now, remember, Robert had to phone David Yollop, who'd written the investigative book Into the Vatican, P2, God's Banker, if I get the title correct. And he got and Yolop actually just sort of screamed at him and said, "How did you get my personal number?" I got Victor Marchetti, who was the deputy director of the CIA and had ratified the Pine Gap Treaty here. He'd measured out the payment from the Americans to take around no. He'd measured out the payment. Just wait, Asper measured out the laying the groundwork here, and I think it was one peppercorn a year. They used to come out and give one peppercorn. But I remember he sounded incredibly intoxicated. The late great now. And just at the end of the phone call, was getting really irate with me. How did you get my number? And I'm not interested in interviewing. And I just slipped it in there. I said, Victor, did you find out during your tenure whether there is an actuality to the ufological conundrum? And he said yes and hung up. And that was it. And that
was enough for you.
Yeah, that was enough for me to go, whoa. So we were looking for a host, and this is where the mastery of Alex Proyas steps in, because he did some very interesting sort of Escher type puzzle pieces for the host to walk into as the introduction.
Which I usually explain that. So basically, Alex's input. He was very keen on having a host, and he actually stipulated that he wanted Doc Neeson. Doc Neeson was the lead singer of an Australian rock band that was hugely successful in the late 70s into the early 80s, the Angels. And Doc at the time was, his music career was sort of on the wane, and the band had sort of disbanded or was not performing a lot. And he was doing a lot of voiceovers for car commercials, essentially, because he had a lovely voice. His background, I think he's Irish, and so
it's beautiful.
And so he stipulated Doc Neeson, and I said, well, Doc's an incredible guy, but he's got no presenter experience. And so we ended up auditioning a lot of well-known actors and personalities. In fact, we auditioned you, Jamie, if I recall.
Yeah.
Well, you know what happened there? I actually was very tired. I didn't know what I was doing. And I remember Alex years later going, that was the worst screen test I've seen in my entire life. I don't think anyone did it so badly. I don't say that about Alex. But the funny thing was, and I actually pulled him up on this recently, because I noticed when he couldn't get actors that he wanted, like Michael Hutchins, he always got someone that looked incredibly similar to that person. And so I pulled him up on, what was that first film? Can you give us the exact...
Spirits of the Air, Gremlins of the Clouds. Yeah. And Michael Hutchins was meant to be in that film.
And the actor that he did get?
I think his name was Norman something, and he called himself in the credits The Norm.
Okay. So he looked a lot... He walked, he sort of dressed, he looked a lot like Michael Hutchins. Well, whether people believe it or not, I said to Alex, you have a tendency to replace people. And even though I probably did the world's worst screen test for you, which would have been one of the most enjoyable to laugh at.
No, it was great. I mean, I thought you were great, but hey.
Doc Neeson all of a sudden appears in a black suit. I was always wearing black
suit,
because by then I was with my wife. She's Greek. Someone's in mourning. Someone's dying. We're just always in mourning. And as you can see through the whole podcast, I've been in black. Asper's in black. Nothing has changed at all. And I've always slicked my hair back. So when it came to actually see this, when it was premiered on TV, and we were all actually in the office as a mystery clock, and I'm 2 hours away from hopping in a mission beat van to drive and pick up the homeless. I look up and I go, good God.
It looks like me.
Doc Neeson is doing a J. Katz impersonation. Anyway, look, we'll move on from that. I just thought that was incredibly funny.
No, but we should say just very quickly that what's actually quite special about Doc, we managed to sort of make work, but I must say, from a directorial point of view, I mean, he was so nervous, and I felt so. But I had to do up to 35. Sometimes I did 50 takes to get an intro because he was so nervous. And also, as you pointed out, what was actually quite unique at the time is that we had a CGI set, and it was done like an Escher jigsaw, and you can see little hints of it in the show. And that was actually quite remarkable for its time. No one in Australia was doing that kind of thing.
It was groundbreaking.
And also the whole thing of, CGI perspectives and stairs and corridors, and it added an atmosphere that I thought was, kind of very engaging and would pull you in. And Doc, I think we were able to edit together.
I
to make
think you pulled that off really well. Now that I'm hearing for the very first time in 27 years that he did that many takes, I assure you that I would have pulled it off in less takes.
In the second take, you would
Yeah.
have done it.
Anyway, look, there was incredible moments of liberation for me in terms of this material, because I don't think this material really broke through into the mainstream world till that sort of X-Files and the beginning really of the 21st century. And then as you can see now, what you achieved by directing that pilot has now become peripheral. The Travel Channel should be called the Conspiratorial,
totally.
Anomalous and Haunting Channel.
Yeah.
And there's just endless programs, and they rate their socks off because people are fascinated. So it was groundbreaking for me that you were someone that not only listened, you paid attention, and you went for those sources like a hungry wolf. And so initially, we did an interview with the late, great Jim Keith, who had been an incredibly prolific author. And I think you are one of just a handful of visual interviews in the world. Very little of Jim remains visually there, where you can actually see who he is, see how erudite he is, and such an incredible investigator. Now I think we should pull back that curtain, if we may, Brendan, and get you to tell us a little bit about how you got in touch with Jim and what it was like being around him, and what did you think of Jim Keith as a researcher. And we might, if you don't mind, pop some images of his literature. That the bulk of it is still available. And if you're unaware of it, you should go to it. And let me just start this with Jim Keith started initially by writing a science fiction zine. And he then went on to write a conspiratorial zine. And he also wrote, and I don't know if he ever told you this, he wrote erotic fiction under a pseudonym. And here's the big cracker. He had already sent me a manuscript for a book he was very worried about. And so he was using a pseudonym initially. And that pseudonym, and when I found out that Jim had died the way he had, I actually took that pseudonym on. And that pseudonym was J. Katz. And that book is The Sources of the Illuminati. So if you don't mind talking to us, yes, it's there. Sure. People will see it. He eventually released it under his name.
Yes, of course.
And it was very sanitized. But I think what he wanted to do is he wanted to throw a bit of, excitement, confusion, and disinformation back at the deformers. So let's start off with The Octopus, which is probably his most well-known and important book about the death of Danny Castellaro and his investigation, whilst Brendan tells us about Jim.
Well, the thing about Jim was that, I'm not sure who made I'm not sure. Did you make the connection through to him, Jamie? Would someone set up that
Yes, I did.
Call?
I was already in communication with him.
Yeah. So what happened is that we agreed to fly him to Vegas, where we were staying, because we were using Vegas as a hub, and because obviously we're going up to Rachel, Nevada, to do the Area 51 stuff. So we flew in Jim, and we basically we just thought it was just an interesting thing. We hired a sort of a room at a sort of really seedy flat, Best and Western motel.
Well, your attention to detail kills me. It really does. That is so X-Files in a way.
Totally. And we were going to shoot a little bit of setup for that he'd be walking into the room and being mic'd. We did shoot a bit of that stuff, but it didn't make the edit. But the idea was, and as you see him in the episode, he's meant to be in a darkened room with just a sort of table lamp, and the idea is that, and it was kind of based on what he told us, that he'd written, very famous books now about the conspiratorial world, Black Helicopters Over America and Sources of the Illuminati. And he he'd said, yeah, that, he'd felt
Mm.
that sometimes his life was being threatened, because he was touching on issues in his literature that were, peeling back the layers that some aspects of the US government were not pleased about being in the public domain. So we kind of played into that a little bit, and we had him set up in this hotel room. And however, the thing about Jim that was fantastic was, besides being incredibly clear, erudite, individual who could actually express his ideas very intelligently and from my point of view, I found Jim to be the most, if I could use this term, coherent out of all the people we'd spoken
No, you can use that term.
because I always have that kind of view where I'm interested in both sides of the spectrum. I'm not sort of buying one way or the other. So I'm always fascinated to see how certain individuals cover this material and how they express themselves. Jim I thought was amazing. And I thought some of his insights were really on the money. Now, in terms of the kind of way that we utilize Jim's, perspective on the whole Area 51 thing was that saga, I should say, was that the Jim saw it as really a campaign of misinformation. And it kind of, actually, to be honest, it kind of felt like that. We'll get into that later. But Jim's perception was counter all the other guys. But I have to say that at the time we were actually shooting all these interviews, the time we were in around this whole area, there was an amazing court case going on at the time, which was workers at Area 51 were suing the government after being exposed, working on toxic radiation.
You've hit the nail on the head here. This is one of the most important aspects about when that story came into the public domain and when it blew up in the mainstream press. And it is so rarely articulated. So go on. Thank you so much for stating this.
Well, no, that was something that actually was. We were watching it at night. I'd go to my hotel room and I'd turn on the news, and there was the story. The workers were progressing through their, through their court case, and so they're up against the federal government and the military establishment. So it was full on. And so
what were they taking the government to court for?
They were basically, most of them were starting to die. I mean,
they were being exposed to toxic fumes.
That's right. They were working on fuel systems that were actually using radioactive elements. And as we know, I mean, there's a whole beautiful symmetry here about the whole Bob Lazar and the element 115 and all that stuff. But we'll get to that later.
It actually ties into that astoundingly. But, let's think about this. They're in this major restricted facility that had already been a nuclear test site, so it was dangerous to begin with. You're talking about the stealth bomber, which was in its infantry stages and really hadn't been shown like it was about to be showcased during the Gulf War. And just the Teflon coating on that thing to keep it radar protected. The strips of that were being burned off, which were highly toxic. There were questions about radioactive dumping. And the interesting thing is what you just stated. These stories were receiving front page notoriety. They were going on the television at night. And believe it or not, once Dennis, who later on was revealed to be Bob Lazar, those stories became relegated to the back of the paper. They weren't receiving. And so we could always say that the Bob Lazar story was very effective in taking the heat away from the government. And now there are other things which you are probably even more aware of. They're encroaching on public land annually. They were making that facility bigger and bigger. And that was something that the public was not that well versed in knowing. One of the most astounding things there, you can dump into a few of these lower pictures.
Okay.
Maybe just that there. We're just going to pictures, excuse us here. There's an object shot around that test site, but it's a massive desert area, and you
Mm.
can tell us about that. So
Sure.
they're encroaching on public land, and that's because already within the conspiratorial, I prefer to call them parapolitical community, the alternative thinkers, the people that were reading all this marginalized literature, that were subscribing to fanzines by people like Jim Keith, had started to gather an interest around this restricted facility. It hadn't ever been articulated by the government, but they were starting to become aware of it. And these court cases were one way they were aware of it. And there were still mountain peaks you could go to. And given good telescopic sights and binoculars, you could maybe get a look at a highly restricted facility. So tell us about that. I'm sorry to jump in there. I'm just trying to sort of
No, that's fine.
preface.
So obviously, our main focus was to try and get as close as possible to this the facility. I mean, obviously, Bob Lazar talked about S4, but we also know we also knew that legitimately there was a facility that's nicknamed Area 51, and so what you're right about, Jamie, is at the time the US government did seize land because too many people and film crews and ourselves included were getting up to an area called White Cliffs,
doing a bit of a peekaboo at White Cliffs, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, and so what happened by the time we got to try and get access? So we went to these are all characters that are in the episode. We'll get to these characters because they're all very interesting.
Maybe we have a break from them at the moment. Let's see the story.
We went to the infamous black mailbox, and that was
which doesn't exist anymore. Which very early, so it doesn't exist. It hasn't existed, I think, for decades. Really,
yeah, they pulled it down.
There's a photo of myself and my cinematographer posing by the black mailbox as we were about to drive down that dirt road, that leads into the base.
And we should lament your cinematographer, who was astounding and is no longer with us either. Can you tell us? He's still with us? Oh, God,
yeah.
God, I've got him buried.
You killed him off?
He just shot a Western with Nick Cage.
Okay. My apologies.
Wow.
Early premature burial on my behalf there. Okay, I'm so glad to hear he's well. I've had his photo of the black mailbox in my toilet for decades, thinking about him, lamenting about him. I don't know how I got confused with that. His
career's rocketing along now. He's doing
okay. Yeah. The stories of his death are highly exaggerated. Yeah. My apologies. Let's keep going.
So what happened is that we got to you're driving through just rough, raw desert, and then suddenly you hit this kind of these signs, which everyone knows. They're warning you about beyond this point, no entry, unauthorized. You can't. There's no gates or anything. It's just these signs.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you, I think we crossed over. I don't know. It was maybe 100 meters or so. I swear to God, bang! These trucks, these security trucks, suddenly emerged.
The camo dudes.
The camo dudes, as they were nicknamed, and that was our real first taste of a bit of how serious this installation was. But we thought, okay, this is as far as we did a little bit of shooting, but of course there are signs everywhere. No photography, no whatever. Use of deadly force authorized by the government. So, okay, we thought you were young, and we said, oh, look, whatever. We'll come back later. And so what we did is at 2 a.m. in the morning, we thought we had cameras and stuff, and we went back to the same place, the black mailbox, in the middle of the night in the desert, and we drove a little bit down the dirt road, and then suddenly, and we actually filmed some of this. We saw this light bobbing in the distance. You imagine through the darkness, and you see this light glowing, and it's bobbing, and it's doing that. And of course, we're all slightly, hang on, that's not some test craft or something. Is it?
Having a UFO experience.
But of course, it wasn't. But it was what it was the light mounted on top of a vehicle that was the security force coming closer and closer. And then and we were filming this. You could hear us talking on the footage, and suddenly we see it's a vehicle, the sort of big SUV pickup things where those trucks were, and they pull up at about, I'd say, be about 200 meters distance, and they just idle. The light shining straight at us, the spotlight on top of the vehicle, and you can hear us going, "What are they doing? This is weird." And you could just hear the car sort of humming in the distance, and then suddenly, booyah! This rifle shot, and we all jump down. The camera goes crazy.
They actually shot at you.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't shot at us, but they shot
above you.
Yeah.
And we literally, scrambled to our feet. You can hear us swearing like, mofos as we got back into the vehicle. And I think there was a second crack that we heard. And we just like U-turned and sped back to Rachel, Nevada. And we were staying in a, sort of
Little Ailey Inn.
A trailer park.
That was called Little Ailey Inn, wasn't it?
Yeah, one of the only standing buildings in the township of Rachel, Nevada, is the Little Ailey Inn, a bar, if you will. And,
now you had an incredible guide with you that was quite affable and then got a little difficult. And I don't know what's happened to this man in terms of history.
I'm dying to know. I would love.
Yeah,
Glenn
I've tried to look up to see anything.
Glenn Campbell, isn't he dead?
No. It's the other Glenn Campbell.
The other Glenn Campbell.
And did he have he'd rented he owned a little shack out there or something?
Yes, but here's the funny story. He had set up his own, I suppose, little shop or it was a little shop catering for ufologists, but he had to build it on the outside the edge of town because they all hated him in Rachel. And Rachel only had a population of 93, so that's give you an example of the. And so he had so you'd come driving down that amazing highway, which just went on forever, and then suddenly there's Glenn Campbell's little shack. And then, I can't remember the name of the shack, but inside there was all these kind of books and pamphlets and fanzines and whatever paraphernalia that would cater for the.
So was he doing guided tours?
Yeah. So part of his shtick was that he was going to give you a guided tour of the area and take you as far as Area 51.
Just desert. There's nothing there, just signs.
But
you have got great footage of him.
Yeah.
On the program, and we'll get to this. I think we'll do a future program because I think we could actually, the rights on that must have receded by now. We could actually do an entire podcast with that doco, but maybe we'll do one with clips. But he's actually pulling out the ammonia detectors, isn't he?
So we use Glenn as our physical guide into Area 51 because he had literally tracked, mapped, logged every aspect he could within realms of being arrested. So he took us on an amazing journey, and there's little clips of it that we use we've used some of it in the actual story, but at the very end we use a couple more. But the bottom line is that he would take us and he would point out all the sensors buried in the dirt in the desert that would actually monitor movement, and then he would point and show us, which we had never seen, solar-powered video cameras that were actually literally meant to be disguised. It's like, cacti or whatever. But they were there, and they were literally filming 24/7, recording movement within thing. So, but because he was such a kind of he was a bit of a doofus, really, because he would kind of pull up all this stuff, rip out the sensor, show it and put it in the camera lens, and then try and bury it again. Of course,
I don't know. I think he might have been a bit irritating, but you need someone who's a bit obsessive, compulsive, and lost to become the person out there that you can actually do what you did. And I don't know if it would have been possible with anyone else.
No. To be honest, Glenn was fantastic. I mean, he gave us a lot of, really interesting anecdotes. He gave us a lot of stories, which none of the whole lot of it didn't make the cut, but the stuff we did use was really good at actually explaining to a mainstream audience what the significance of what was going on here, but also from just simply the concept that this is a base that had been there historically since the late 40s, and the bottom line is that the government, up silly at that point, the government was still denying it didn't exist. and that was true. I mean, even that time they were denying it was in existence. So Glenn was very much about peeling back the layers a little bit, and he was able to kind of show us and take us to places that could illustrate all this. So this made it very personable and very vivid. But of course, he was also pretty weird.
Oh yeah, I think you'd have to be, and I think he might have had some personality issues, some gender issues.
Did he live there permanently?
Yeah.
Well, no, he actually. No, it's funny you should say that, Asper, because he did have a base. I think a home back in Vegas.
That's
so
right.
I think he would come back and forth.
Right.
And,
now, was he the one that was recording the
yes.
blacked out window air flights out of the Janus terminal? The fluid, yeah.
So that's
and John Lear too. John Lear was doing that as well.
Yes. You may need to clarify that.
Now, if there's anyone online watching us that knows what happened to Glenn, please give him our love. And we're not trying to be derogatory.
No, he was fabulous. I loved Glenn. I thought he was such a great character. Because, a lot of the times when you in this world, in this anomalous conspiratorial world, you meet, people who obviously very devout, very devoted to the cause or their interest. Glenn kind of was certainly that way inclined, but he kind of created a sort of a persona that was very, for us, from that point of view of being quite televisual. He wore his kind of outfit. He had his cap on. He
had all the badges, and he was just remarkable. Oh, look, I think he's a latter-day hero in many ways. And let me ask you one thing. This became such an active spot that the US, that's why they started to encroach on more land. It was these people are going insane. Bus trips are coming out here. Hundreds of, but when you were out there, this was early in the piece. Was there much traffic? Was there many other people around? No one.
No. So that was fantastic because I was aware, certainly in the year or 2 or 3 years after we'd been there, it was like a tourist site. When we were there, I mean, there was maybe 1 or 2 people that had popped in, driven by, dropped in the little alien or something. But when we were out filming, there was no one else around for miles. We couldn't see anyone. And
this story of Bob's, it took time to gestate, didn't it? It took time to grow.
It was interesting because, and as you know, Jamie, I mean, Bob's story, George Knapp, broke the story in '89. And look, it was obviously, I mean, you probably, I mean, there's George there. And we we interviewed George at Channel 8, which is the Vegas
Clash TV, isn't it?
Yeah.
And George was like a crime reporter, wasn't he?
Yeah. I actually knew of George because he was doing lots of mafia stories. I mean, news stories.
Here we go. And this is the shot I wanted you to get of George, and you got it because I said, get that goddamn guy in a convertible on the strip at night. Say it's one thing to report on organized crime, but when I got to the UF, and you got it.
We stuck him in a Mustang convertible, and we interviewed him, as you know, up and down the strip late at night, and he loved it because it was like George in his element, and he was so cool. I mean, obviously George, he's a consummate performer as well as
he's still going today. He's a big part of that documentary, James Corbell's documentary, and he's become a world-renowned ufological researcher. He did a lot of great work in Russia, but he still operates out of Class TV, Channel 8.
Well, because the other thing I was going to say is that he was actually a great journalist. I mean, his crime stuff, I'm a big fan of. When he was busting stories on Vegas mob, characters and their criminality. He had that kind of almost like a kind of Pulp Fiction feel to his kind of delivery, and he certainly made a compelling television, that's for sure.
And so, you know what? That Pulp Fiction feel is something we all romanticize. But once you get into this arena, you realize how rare it is to come across someone that is the genuine fish.
Yes.
And George has integrity. He has skepticism, but when he sees a good story, he's going to go after it like a shark.
Yeah.
And that was the great thing about George was that, look, I think what I appreciate about it from his perspective is that, like any journalist worth their salt, I mean, he knew he'd sort of stumbled on this fabulous story, but really, what was the reality of it? What was the truthfulness of it? And as we know, and he's been very clear about this. I mean, he did lots of background research, and particularly with Bob's story, trying to track down his past, alleged employment and all that sort of stuff, and activities to try and validate what Bob had said, which was sensational. But I kind of felt that what was great about George was he was a sober voice, in a world which could easily become hysterical, And you've got some guests.
That's all right.
No, you go to that bit, Steph. I'll stay here with Brendan.
All right, you keep going.
Always irritates me, but we're living a life, and that's the way it is.
That's what we love.
Look, that is just so incredibly fascinating. George Knapp is a remarkable person. I suggest you should check him out. And he made some groundbreaking documentaries very early in that time as well.
Yes. Obviously, I was aware of George. Obviously through research you had provided, Jamie, and so I could go off on my own little tangent and see what he was up to. So by the time I met him, I was pretty well versed in his career and what he was doing. And actually, what was great is that we just hung out with him at the studio where he was working as he was a well-known presenter and journalist. And it was great to see him in his own element. We shot him on the soundstage doing the nightly news. We obviously shot him in the offices where where he'd be doing all his stuff and his research and so forth. And I think in a way, George is kind of responsible for really making the Lazar story tangible, believable, and certainly something that he was able to give it some sort of weight, which could easily be lost and dispersed by cynics and critics or anyone.
Oh, that's where that ringing was coming from. Walk away. Is everything all right there? Great to have you back.
Everything's fine. It's
hello.
all good.
Okay, great to have you back. Look,
Nick
I'm so sorry to interrupt that with the George story there. But George was not just the sort of bridge over troubled water into this story. There were many people we had to navigate.
That's
With
right.
Bob Lazar, we had a great go-between who was a local, have I got this right, a real estate agent who'd become a bit of a sort of ancient alien hypothesis man. His name is Gene Huff.
Gene Huff, yes.
Yeah. And let's pop that slide up.
Yeah.
And look, you were out there. What had happened with Bob Lazar, evidently, before he became the shadowy dentist and then turned into himself?
Yep.
He was taking Gene out and the estranged son of the inventor of the Learjet, William Lear, John Lear. There they are, both around the perimeter fence, and they were filming what Bob said was the test of the sports model of the alien spacecraft he'd evidently been back engineering out there. So let's have a little, foot into the covertly bizarre world of John Lear.
Well, so John Lear, really, I mean, talk about a character. Oh my God.
You're going to love this photo. Look at this. And he's reading the Playboy upside down, so he's obviously looking at the pictures.
Not
this
reading
November.
the articles.
And there's a toy. And you know what? We only lost John this year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the start of the year, I think March. Well,
what was fascinating about John was when we went to his abode, which was like a kind of fortress in a way. It was no, I'm quite serious. It was he had like about 10 satellite dishes on his roof. He had all these kind of like sensors and things, and CCTV cameras everywhere.
Not an operative, definitely not.
No, so you kind of go, hello, where am I walking into? And but the thing about him was he was intense, almost. He was unnerving. I think it was a way, because he was so precise and exact about what he was talking about. and there was an element of irony or humor or anything about what he was saying. When he said to me point blank, yeah, they have 9 species of aliens and various stasis tubes at the facility. You're kind of going, okay, and then you're asking questions, and he was pretty kind of intense. And of course, the thing about him was, as you guys know, I mean, I'm looking at his bedroom, not his bedroom, his study wall where we filmed, and there's images of him with what's his name, Gordon Liddy,
Yeah. This is some guy who's telling us he's a commercial pilot, right?
Yeah.
And he also had an incredibly huge covert career.
Yes,
and they believe he might have been the October surprise pilot.
The pilot, yeah.
With the change of presidents in the US
From
over
Carter to Reagan.
That's right, in the arms deal there. And I believe once in the company, you're always in the company. Now, that, of course, the shot we had up before is George interviewing him on TV. And this is what he looked a lot better than this shot.
Oh, that looks like he had it towards the end of his life by the sound.
Yeah,
yes, it was. It was. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know whether it's the chicken or the egg here, but these stories started to come out before the Bob Lazar story. He had gone forward, and I think with George Knapp and the Dulce papers, he'd actually and these papers were really frightening. And if anything, in retrospect, maybe one of the biggest dumps of disinformation in the public domain by anyone during that period of time. It was around the time then that he actually, I don't know how he did it, much to the chagrin of Walt Andrus, he ended up being the part of MUFON and presenting a huge conference. And I could be wrong here, but I would think it was the conference that the co-author William Moore with Stanton Freeman, who had been seen as an incredibly honest and meticulous researcher, stated that he was involved with disinformation. The name Richard Doherty came up for the very first time, and they assisted in the psychological decline of Paul Benowitz, who was in that area and recording sounds. Well, not in exactly that area. That's a whole other story we don't have the time to go into. Yeah. But this had been brewing prior to the Lazar story coming out. And I believe that, I don't know if this is true, that John Lear said he had met Bob Lazar working in a photo processing lab in Vegas when he took some shots in. Is that correct?
No, he didn't say that to me. So,
right.
But here's something.
I could be wrong there.
No. But there's something I want to say about John Lear. Something very strange occurred. So, as you know, we're going around. We're interviewing Bob a number of times. Obviously Jim Keith and all these characters. But the weird thing was, for the life of me, I can't remember the exact aspect, but there was something that I'd said to Bob during the interview. It was a comment or a question. I can't remember how it was. Now, what I'd heard is that Bob and Jim hadn't seen each other for a year. That's what Jim had said. Jim had said, "Oh, I haven't seen Bob for about a year now."
John Lear, you say?
John said that. Yeah, John Lear said that to me.
Yes.
I said, "Oh, okay." And they said, "No, I haven't seen Bob for about a year, and it's I hope he's okay." La la la. I haven't spoken to him at all. But the fact is that John repeated something that I'd said to Bob off the cuff in our conversation, and it just occurred to me. Obviously, they'd been on the phone, before we'd arrived. So they'd exchanged a little bit of, and I can imagine,
No, but that's really interesting information.
He's a liar.
No. Hold on. That's really interesting information because, speaking with Robbie Graham, and I was astounded to hear Robbie Graham actually state, that he feels that Bob is sincere. And in a sense, Bob, as I said before, that has remained very concise and clear and consistent in his narrative for a long time now. And that's quite difficult when you're deceiving. But what you're stating there is actual evidence alluding to something else behind the scenes going on.
That's kind of what got me thinking, and it's something that I brought up with Jim Keith. when I was talking to Jim off camera, I was saying, what's interesting about this whole story, Jim, this was the conversation. I said, what I'm finding is that total outsider to all this, I'm all fresh and new to this, is that I understand there are key players in the story and in the narrative. I said, but what's interesting is that it seems like they're all very interconnected into the story, for various reasons I couldn't understand at the time. And Jim had a whole take on that, and he kind of said, he kind of had his own take on it. So who knows if that's the exact truth or not? But his take was, if I can paraphrase it, and he kind of says it in a manner in the interview that we used in the segment. And he kind of said that they were actually working as a unit, a collusion, and that part of their thing was to maintain various myths about what was happening at this installation. And the idea was always to this is Jim's idea, was that create a sensational furphy over here, so your eye goes to there, and there's something more important staring you right down the thing. Now, what's amazing is that time has proven all that to be kind of true to a point. Now, I don't dispute Bob's a very interesting character, and we can talk about him. But he, as you say, is incredibly clear and concise. And having just watched, Jeremy Corbell's doco, just as an update, it was great to sort of see that, because I can relate my experience, 25, 26 years ago to, watching that from a couple of years ago.
And wasn't that different to what Jeremy actually recorded there, was it?
Completely.
Which is amazing.
But what I thought was fascinating was that it did suggest this idea that was there, from Jim's perspective, and look, as you guys know, I mean, all his literature and his points of view. He was always thinking that this was an organized, creation to be a sort of a obfuscation, if you will, and so he was suggesting they'll work colluding together, and they were all maintaining this thing. So that was just one funny little aspect that kind of emerged almost out of nowhere for me. And John seemed like, I'd have to say, a very suspect character. If there was ever a suspect character, that guy just reeked of, and the fact that
do you know the fact that the Byrds wrote a song? Do you know this one? I think it's Foxtrot 2-4. It's about the Learjet. Do you know the Byrds song about that?
No,
and
I
it's
don't.
probably the least lyrical song of the Byrds, because it just basically is one line about we're in a Learjet. But very early in the piece, it has a sample, and that sample is John Lear. It runs from the very start of the track to the end, and it's John Lear in the Learjet asking for landing coordinates and all that sort of thing. So John Lear was an interesting cat who had this peripheral pop cultural thing where he would weave himself in and out. And you realize, as well as I do, it took a long time for the 1960s Adam West, Burt Ward Batman series to end up in the public domain and remastered. Now, I can't remember the episode, you might recall, but they do a little parody episode on a tycoon like Howard Hughes, who operated out of Vegas and Nevada, in those declining years before he disappeared, and no one knows really what happened there. And in that, there is a Learjet.
Yep.
And the person standing, looking over the Learjet without a speaking role is John Lear.
He's in a Batman episode.
He's in a Batman episode.
I gotta check that.
Yeah, you'll find it.
And we will find it. We'll find that clip one day and try and get around it in terms of like showing it to the public. But if you search out your Batman, he's in there. So it's really odd how John just sort of weaves in and out popular culture, have never any fear about his own profile, yet he'd been very reckless, and I think that's what tore his father and him apart in terms of their relationship when he was a youngster, in terms of his piloting career. Became a commercial pilot, and he was filming those flights out of the Janus terminal as well. Is that right?
Is that right? Well,
because I got a tape that I assume
Yes.
must have been from John Lear.
Mm.
But here's an interesting thing. Maybe it was from Glenn Dennis, and maybe Glenn Dennis is part of this because I
Glenn
took
Dennis
a phone call.
Glenn Campbell.
Glenn
Glenn
Campbell,
Campbell.
sorry, yeah, we're getting
Yeah.
muddled there. I'm thinking of the
Jesus.
Roswell
Yeah. The
mortician.
mortician.
Yeah, it's all mixing up. I got a phone call from John Lear saying, I'm in Sydney.
Mm.
You still owe me for postage, like $25 Australian. And I'm like, it's the great
Oh.
John Lear, and he must be worth millions. And he's
Yes.
asking me for $25 Australian.
That's why he's
Well,
worth
that's it.
millions.
That's right. That's usually the case, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
And yeah, he wasn't short of a penny. Yeah, I can
No.
verify that.
And that was weird. And maybe
yes.
that was just part of the game, trying to suss
Yes.
out who I was.
I'd
But to
say
this
so.
day, I still have that NTST tape, and
I know that
have a
tape.
digital.
I know that tape, Jamie.
It's a remarkable tape.
Yes, I believe from my memory, it actually came from Glenn Campbell, and the tape of all the workers getting on board, because Glenn was talking about that a lot to me. In fact, he was
Right.
going to take it. He was going to take us on one of his filming missions. And
Had
we were gonna
he
be
ever
down-
mentioned any relationship with Bob Lazar or
So that's the
Gene
point.
Huff?
That's the point. So
Yeah,
Glenn
right,
always seemed outside of that group of gentlemen, right?
right.
Mm.
But I started to find connections. I mean, and there were things such as just comments that, particularly when you're off camera and you're putting mics on and stuff like that. The chit chat is where a lot of the gems lie.
Mm.
Not necessarily about the subject, but about just who they are and what they're doing. And I suspected that even though Glenn seemed like an outlier, an outlier, sort of
A lone cannon on himself
literally,
in the desert. Yeah.
A peripheral dweller.
Exactly, maybe barnacling onto their kind of scene, but
Mm.
the unwanted guest at a house party. But he did seem to have sort of I don't know. It's just speculation.
Right, okay.
That he was interconnected. So yeah, I really wanted to go down to film with this. I mean, we're running short of time.
Let's peel back the curtain on the most important person in this story, which is Bob Lazar. Now, the story is that Bob Lazar had been part of this incredible in the desert sort of, crazy petrol head, nitro fueled cars thing. And it had been documented in the local newspaper. And Edward Teller had read the story and saw him on the steps somewhere where Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, the man that's remained incredibly angry all his life that he didn't drop the thing properly somewhere.
Should have dropped it on
and
America.
he was the one that recommended him for the job at S4, Groom Lake, Dreamland, Nevada. Now, tell us about what it was like dealing with Bob, what you came across. And we had to negotiate and pay, I think, $1,000 US to Gene Huff to get the Bob Lazar interview.
That's right. And as you guys know, I mean, generally speaking, in the world of documentary, it's a kind of an unsaid. I mean, you don't normally pay.
No, you don't.
No.
And especially when it comes to this important information needs to be in the public domain. People need to be aware of it. Here's an actual shot, which I thought was remarkable. It was your opening shot.
Yeah.
And it was in the desert just prior to twilight of him walking across. It was just a fabulous, captivating, exciting shot.
Well, we shot that on Super 8 film to give it a sort of a
That's
raw
why it
effect.
looks like that.
The grain.
Yeah, and grainy and so forth. And so I think, and what's fascinating about that, purely on as a side comment, is that I noted that years later, other conspiracy documentaries that were actually dealing with Bob Lazar copied some of this technique.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we were just trying to give it a sort of an edge, give him a bit of shade of mystery, because essentially he does come across as the Jerry Seinfeld of atomic nuclear science.
Well, I love that. That's actually great.
Because he's got his Harry High pants and
the quirky everyman.
Yeah.
He's dressing a lot dapper these days. And I mean, you were finding things on his fridge that he needed to buy more Polonex. Is that right?
Indeed, yes. He was a great fan of what we call the skivvies down here in Australia, but they're polo neck tops elsewhere. But anyway, so the thing about that's a really important point, Jamie, to talk about that, because Gene Huff was acting as his agent. Okay. So what had happened since the 89 revelation with George Knapp? So the story had seeped out into the world, and international crews from France and the UK, it's starting to find seek out to interview Bob. But we were still early on in the case because it hadn't got to fever pitch. And I think Bob's story got to fever pitch around the early 2000s. It was like out of control by then, you know. But so we had to deal with Gene, and Gene was always kind of hovering around, and he was, I mean, to be honest, he was a pain in the ass, because we just wanted to sit down and, you know, part of the thing when you want to do
Gene was, I'd say, the CCTV camera for
yeah.
Bob and Lear. Yeah.
But mainly, I mean, if I can be blunt, and I think it's fair to say that he was also on the hustle all the time. And hey, how much is that? You guys going to charge for that, or what? Hey, what are we doing here, Bob? You know, it was that kind of shtick, and I kind of felt like, guys, I mean, Gene, just go and have a coffee, sit down and relax, so I can talk to Bob, get some kind of bond going, so I can get, you know, the thing.
Yeah, a good interview.
Get in. So that's why
get my money's worth.
Get my
yeah.
So anyway, so I kind of felt a little bit funny about it, because
of course
already I sort of saw it through kind of already. Bob was being used in a commercial sense. And I'm sure, look, I don't know what Bob's opinion about that is. I mean, whether he was really, yes, we got to do this, we got to monetize my story, monetize me, or was it Gene that brought that into the equation? Who knows? But of course,
did you see Gene's name mentioned in the credit of James' documentary? I don't think that Gene's around anymore.
No, I think there's a slight comment from George Knapp, who says that Bob would love to still see Gene and all those guys. I think there's a comment in an interview with George, which well, I mean, obviously two things. I mean, Bob's moved twice. Well, as far as we know, he's moved out of Vegas. He went to Michigan. He's now in Oregon, I think. Is that right?
Maybe. I can't assure you of that.
Yeah. So anyway, he's obviously moved to other parts of the country, and so but Gene, so Gene was. But the funniest thing with Gene was, and this is great for the end credits, as you know, we snuck in this footage, which was I brought along the big book of conspiracies, the graphic novel of conspiracies, and
I can remember giving that to you because. Yes. You had what was a stray sound guy that we imagined would not sit down and read everything Correct. You needed to get background on these people. So I thought, hey, this comic book actualization will assist him in getting up to speed rapidly.
So when I pulled it out to show Bob, and we filmed it, and this is obviously a close-up, and he literally read, "Oh my God, that's too small for human butts," and he just cracked up because he was seeing his story done as a graphic novelization, and he loved it. He was laughing.
He'd never seen it before, had he? The big book of conspiracies.
He had no idea. Now, Gene's standing behind him in that clip with the red shirt on, just behind him, and
right.
And then what happened was that as Bob's reading it, and he's laughing, and exactly, that's the exact moment.
That's Gene.
That's
and then Gene steps forward, literally just after the shot, and says, "Hey, did these guys pay? What's the rights on this, Bob? What do we got to do about this?" No, I'm serious. He said, "We got to chase these guys up. They can't do this. You got to be worth something." It was like, I mean, that was shot on camera, but it was never used for obvious reasons. And it was just one of that. It was what could I say? An anomaly around the anomaly. You know what I mean? That was like but Bob was delighted. But the other thing about Bob was that we got to hang out with him. So he took us all out to his favorite Italian restaurant. And of course, anyone knows me. I love Italian food. I love Italian culture. And I'm particularly fascinated in that whole kind of Vegas, Italian American, almost kind of slightly dodgy mafioso world as well. And so Bob took us to this great restaurant. And I think or the owner of the restaurant was simply called Mr. Tony, which is kind of funny, Signor Tony. And it was actually, in a really anonymous strip mall. You pulled in, and there was a bunch of things, and there was this restaurant, and you went inside, and it was over the top. There was these fountains with red and green lights illuminating the water, and then all these amazing portraits on the wall of Signor Tony, who literally had the unbuttoned shirt and the gold medallion and the bouffant hair and the tight slacks.
Wow.
And he was a very elegant Italo-American guy, and he was like, "I'm pleased to meet you. You are friends of Bob." And Bob said, "Yeah, these are my friends from Australia. We're going to have some." Bob said, "The linguine here is fantastic. It's the best linguine in Vegas, and all that stuff." And I went, "Wow, this is great." But there was all these great shots of Signor Tony with Frank, Peter Lawford,
All the big names.
The Rat Pack, man.
Sammy. He was with them all. I mean, and everyone.
Now with Bob Lazar.
Exactly. That's right. So we're sitting in this booth, and it was just so cool. I was just going, I'm loving this place. I wish we had a photo of it anyway. And there was Bob with the polar neck, and and sitting there eating away with his eating his linguine, and it's Sion and I and Sally Reagan, our production manager, and we're just having a great time. And Bob was really great in that sense that he was really when he was relaxed, and he just wasn't this kind of nerdy guy that loved science, loved chemistry, loved building turbo retro rocket engines. He was obsessed with them, as we all know.
But he was a nice enough guy. He wasn't arrogant. He was a nice enough person.
He was actually, when you see those early Knapp interviews, that's who he is. I mean, that's pretty much him. Understated.
And I think James captured that too. He's still that person today.
Yeah, I think so.
In some ways, the one thing that makes you believe that there could be something to the Bob Lazar story, he always has appeared as a person that's very reticent to actually say this. And
I think what happened is, again, at the time with Gene as his manager, I think he got pushed further and further to make money. That I'm sure Gene was taking his cut, of course, naturally. And but what was fascinating for me to watch Jeremy Corbell's documentary was the seeing Bob reflect over the last 30 years of this, and what it had done to his life, what it had meant to him. And of course, as you know, he seemed incredibly uncomfortable now talking about things that were infamous now after all these years. But one thing I can say, I mean, because having hung out with him, and I must add, the other little funny anecdote was being in his kitchen leaning up against his fridge and noticing all these photos with him and Deborah Harry. See, Chris Stein and Debbie Harry were big fans of Bob Lazar at the time in the 90s.
Wow, from Blondie.
Yeah, from Blondie. And I said, "Hey, what's Debbie Harry doing here, Bob?" "Oh, Debbie and Chris, they're friends of mine. We just kind of hang out together from time to time. I'm going, great.
There'll be the next link in the chain to the John Lear, Glenn Campbell story. The next set of operatives we've come across, maybe.
But the thing was, yeah, it's fantastic. The thing was is that looking at that doco, I thought what's really interesting was that, okay, so as you say, Jamie, his stories remain incredibly consistent, not just consistent, but incredibly consistent. But as we know, certain things that he talked about back in '89, which were seen as ridiculous and outrageous and preposterous, element 115, which was officially recognized in 2013. And he was talking about it as a fuel, as a form of fuel that was used to drive the propulsion systems of these craft. And here's the thing. Maybe, look, I don't know. I'm no goddamn scientist in nuclear physics and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, the fact that he was certainly able to not only pinpoint that as a fuel for this thing, but the way it would be used. is fascinating in itself. But the fact that it was seen as ridiculous that this element didn't exist and couldn't exist, and then
And
20
now
years
it does
later,
exist. Yeah.
Well, it theoretically existed. I think
All right.
they found it for a couple of nanoseconds, and
That's
the
right. Yeah.
science is out of Europe, and no one's entirely sure. But you know what? The interesting thing is, it's just that consistency in the story. I can't help but feel. Yeah, you did some research into looking into the veracity of his claims, and you brought up footage of the court case for pandering. And there's a lot of when you go into pages like, I'd love to know who is the behind the curtain there on Wikipedia, because we're getting to one person, we're going a bit longer than realized, but when we get to another character we had in that documentary, the absence of any Wikipedia page speaks volumes to me, let alone some people have the most minor Wikipedia pages. And the Wikipedia page on John Lear is very thin as well, which says
And
to
it
me,
shouldn't be.
no, it shouldn't be. It's extremely. I think I've got a longer Wikipedia page than John Lear, but there's distinctly something there and something not. And Robbie Graham, who we interviewed, would say, I believe he believes his story, but I'm sure he's being used as a tool, as a pawn.
Totally.
This is perception management. And as you said before, the game of disinformation is a very convoluted, deceptive, wicked web that they weave. Now, one of the other things you told me extensively that you saw in the hallway, and I've always believed that Bob, as opposed to being a scientist, and I was asking, I'm sorry, I've digressed those questions too. Tell us about trying to find his qualifications at MIT, which he did and stuff like that. I've always assumed he was a bit like Standeo here, someone very literate on the subject matter, but more of a fan than an academically acclaimed individual.
And you know what? That's kind of where I've kind of come to my conclusion. I think you're hitting on something really interesting there, Jamie, because yes, as you know, it's famous because a lot of other people have tried to do the same thing, which is, Bob claims he was at MIT and and Caltech. He was a student at both those campuses, and that and then there's no reference of him being there, although friends have emerged to say that they have recollections of him attending those institutions. However, infamously, we know that he claims he worked at the Los Alamos facility, and no one could verify that except this phone directory, of course. And we have evidence of the phone directory, and we have evidence of one other thing, the pay stub. And he had that pay stub. And what was interesting about it, he had it. And so in his possession, he had the pay stub, and he had, I believe, a copy of that. Would have been like a Xerox or something, I think. If I can think that's the case, my memory. It's a long time ago.
And this is where George Knapp sort of said, there's something distinctly here that could be sincerely real. But the unfortunate thing for me is the late Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist, never got to have a healthy dialogue with Bob Lazar. And I think that would have been a really good thing in terms of decoding, because we've got no idea. We are totally illiterate on that subject matter, and you can bamboozle us in the public domain easily if you don't understand. But I'm sure Stanton would have been able to pull out the reality or not. So he always remained highly skeptical.
He was. Stanton Friedman was very skeptical, as I remember, about Bob Lazar's story. And I think I think there's a side of the story where you're quite right, that Bob was a young, nerdy science geek as a boy, loved mucking around with explosive chemicals and various things, and but a rank amateur at best, an incredibly driven, knowledgeable, smart amateur,
probably self-taught. He was self-taught.
And sometimes there are moments in the industrial military complex where someone like that could be just the brain you need for a short amount of time to think outside of the square. Or someone like that could be just so voraciously passionate that it's time that you actually grab them and let them run with this story.
No, this is,
my take on Bob Lazar, is that he was, a fan of this stuff, knowledgeable in it, probably self-educated by it. And they needed somebody, they being, whoever it is that puts these stories out every decade or so. And they thought, this kid's perfect. Let's show him and tell him some stuff and then send him out and see what he does with it. And his handler, I believe, was John Lear, because he's got so many connections to that, and he's out there spreading that misinformation. I actually remember in the very early 90s seeing a lecture on by Lear and him describing all these different levels underneath,
the
facility, and that I remember that specifically him saying level 7 was named the nightmare level, which is where, and he said this, which is where they were doing all the experiments with the cattle mutilations and the abductees, and there were vats of people
horrific
stories floating around everywhere. And I'm watching this, and I mean, for a moment I was thinking, why isn't this in the paper? And then I went, hang on, this can't be real, seriously. So he was out there scaring and muddying the waters, which is what, disinformation advocates do, is go out there and with a bit of real information, then just put in these horrific and really absurd and ridiculous stories, and then you don't know what's true and what's not. But I think whatever they showed Bob and said to him, that he believed it, and that's why he's been out there and was always consistent in his story, because he truly believes that's what was happening.
Well,
so I don't know. That's my take on it.
I mean, it's all very interesting, because if you go to his website of his company, I mean, he has as you know, he's had a company for 30 years, which is a supplier of, lab
scientific instruments and scientific equipment.
Yeah. But he also sells mugs and sells T-shirts and model kits and sells his autobiography. Exactly. He also sells. In fact, what was a little bit alarming, this is only a personal point of view, not an astute observation, but he had actually, from Jeremy Corbell's documentary, we see him, sketching what he remembers about the craft. And of course, that's now, you can get a mug from that sketch. From the documentary.
And that tester model we put up then. And one of the interesting things is, one of the first places to declassify classified information
every time
is either Phil Klass, when he was alive, the aviation space.
Scientific, aviation.
You threw me
Sorry.
then. I've lost the title. There's either those magazines or there's the model kit world where they actually get declassified. Did you tell me that, and this is a memory of mine, that his hallway, there were quite a lot of those model kits in it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was the weird thing, because in a way you're dealing with this kind of amazing story. And yet there it is. You got a model kit to the left, little aliens, And what was weird, I saw a moment, maybe I'm imagining this because of in the Corbell documentary, is Bob's actually playing with the model. He's actually fingering one of the little aliens. He lifts the lid off the top of it and starts playing with the model. So that's he obviously likes the model kits of his the craft that he saw and back engineered. But it was all a bit odd. I mean, back then too. I guess I was just fascinated to see where Bob was. So I went to his company, and I think so. Yeah, you could buy all these sort of quite advanced bits of equipment and things from him, and test tubes and glass containers and beakers and various analytical bits of equipment and so forth. But you can also buy a lot of paraphernalia about Area 51 and his story. So,
isn't that incredible?
But in that documentary, which I find fascinating, the one thing that was obviously I was really keen on was the story about him being raided in recent years, and which George Knapp talks about. And and the idea that he may be selling element 115 or has that.
I think there was a little twist there. I think maybe Jeremy, not so much Bob, was twisting that to allude that it could be that. And primarily that interesting raid was about, but Jeremy did state that, when that raid occurred, they were making statements to Bob that were like directly off the phones that they had off during an interview. And, 30 or so forensic guys there for what was supposed to be an invoice.
Yeah, that sounded really suspect. And of course,
that's really over the top, isn't it?
Yeah.
So very interesting. When you finally get to the very end of the Vegas Strip with George Knapp, there's a beautiful series of closing lines there that I still think are quite poetic in the world of alternate, media dealing with these subject topics. And that is to say that Area 51 had now moved to Australia.
Yeah.
It had moved down here. And the new Area 51 was our space facility. Pine Gap. Yes.
But that was actually a great line from George. But also, Bob sort of backed it up as well. Bob said in the same, in the interview that, and it made total sense. That the craft at S4 and all the facility itself had been long since moved on. And that made total sense if you take that story all the way at face value. Now, it was amazing. Bob said he speculated somewhere in the South Pacific. And separately, George offered up Pine Gap because it was a joint research facility between the US and Australia. It has long been, the subject of a lot of intrigue, to put it mildly. And it just was a very titillating, almost salacious concept that, we'll bring our Aussie friends and that's to ship the whole 9 craft down there and the whole research facility. And of course, I love that idea.
How do they get them down here on a Carnival cruise? I mean, but you know what? What is brilliant is that there is so much deception and so many sightings in that area or across Australia, but it's very congested up there. And we're going to allude to the fact that we do have someone coming on this podcast in the future that helped install all the original, very early in the piece, CCTV cameras out at Pine Gap. Wow. And they're not spilling any secrets, so don't bomb the house late at night, but they have some interesting ufological stories. Now, Pine Gap was sold to the Australian public as a joint space research facility, and NASA had 3 front offices in Alice Springs in which the Venetian/Venusian blinds were down and no one had access to them. And it wasn't until the late 70s that out of Australia's ANU University, that Dr. Desmond Ball, who you interviewed, came forward to say that this is not a space research facility. This is an electronic eavesdrop and intercept station, and it is probably a first strike target for any enemy or maybe ally that you're eavesdropping on during a nuclear confrontation. And he wrote the first book, Demystifying Pine Gap, away from that. So a very dangerous facility, very restricted, heavily American facility. And they used to fly in the most massive cargo planes in the world to take out a lot of magnetic tape for analysis in the States and vice versa, bring it in for analysis here. So tell us a little bit about Dr. Desmond Ball, because there was some intrigue there as well.
Oh, I guess so. I mean, he was a very credible subject to interview. And, he's not someone I would even, for the moment, think, was...
All right, I can remember a story by your producer. I'm not going to go particularly into this, but they had found what looked like, when they were setting up interviews, the fact that this man had been going to restricted facilities, and one of them was the Groom Lake facility.
Now, I don't know. That's interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Memory. So it's going from Glen Campbell now back to Australia. Anyway, look, this is all alleged material. It's nearly 27 years later. We're running out of time, but one person I really want to get to that, oddly enough, did lecture with high credentials out of Harvard at MIT for 15 years was the brother, another estranged relationship of the great filmmaker Brian De Palma, who gave us Carrie and so many other astounding
Sisters.
Yep. Bruce De Palma, who ended up coming from the States, came out to Australia, and then ended up in New Zealand. And you interviewed him just literally months before he died.
So, yeah,
And
I mean,
he's got no Wikipedia page.
No
No Wikipedia
that's
page.
really weird because
That's very weird.
I mean, Bruce, as we mentioned in the sort of setup, is that he was a great inventor. In fact, one of the things that I mean, I think both of the De Palma boys were quite genius in there and obsessive. But Bruce, obviously, our focus was his end machine, his free energy machine, and even though he'd done some extraordinary things with 3D photography for Polaroid and so forth before that as an inventor, his end machine was something that was considered a threat to corporate energy all around the world. So, Bruce had always alleged that he became the subject of, targeted attacks through CIA fronts and so forth, which is why he fled to the Antipodes and then to New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it was a very strange environment that we went to. He was in this this compound on the outskirts of Auckland, literally in the kind of the bush, if you will, in the sort of forests around.
And maybe if I could just interject quickly, Bruce did work for Polaroid and invented a polarizing system that he's acclaimed
3D,
for.
Yep.
And I don't know if it was 3D, but
was it?
it's an
I thought
interesting.
it was.
Oh,
Yeah,
was
I think
it?
it was a 3D thing. Yeah.
And he was very respected there, but there was scandal that followed him. And even in his death, there was scandal involved in just the forensic toxicity reports that were found. And so he was one of these characters that you don't know whether he was actually running away from, exposing to the world the truth about maybe possibly that there is zero energy point, there is over unity. The end machine was a series of highly powerful magnets, neodymium magnets, in wooden chocks that would spin diametrically opposed. He believed that he'd already got images of them being filmed with time dilation. I had 3 hours of extraordinary material that I think you got for me on tape.
Yes.
That was actually to be used in another ABC radio documentary that mysteriously was stolen. Which is really...
There's nothing mysterious about it. I know who stole it.
Oh, don't say...
I'm not naming names.
Yeah, you calm, will you? But that was very weird.
Don't push me.
We'll calm down.
Well,
but anyway, let's get back to what you found when you went to Bruce's place.
Bruce's thing was that, okay, so Bruce he was very much from the hippie generation of the 60s, so he smoked a lot of weed. That was one thing was interesting before every interview, just sort of like
which is so odd because he comes across so erudite in those interviews, so brilliantly literate. And do you know that the interview with him out of the documentary Conspiracy is the most used? You can go on YouTube and find it now. It was taken by a European documentary company and inserted as their own footage, that entire piece.
Can you get money from that?
No, I will give you the title in the future. But if you punch in Bruce De Palma into YouTube, you will see that documentary, its title, and it was completely stolen and burged.
There you go. My life story. But anyway, the thing about it, I've got to say, is that what was strange about going to Bruce's, holdout, his compound, was he was obviously, I'd say there was a certain level of paranoia about, how you got in there and so forth. But he had this, and I have to say this, and I think this is kind of valid because it forms part of, a thing of accusations about him, was he had this whole kind of entourage of teenage boys. Let's put that in
Okay.
perspective. So people get hysterical. But what was
People
odd
will
about
get
it?
hysterical.
They will. But they were like kind of like
Interns.
interns, but they were more like his harem. They were in tight shorts, little t-shirts,
I
and
shouldn't
they
laugh
greeted you
about
at the
this.
door, and they said, "Oh, hello, you're here to see, Bruce." And I go, "Yes, thank you, Mindy. Come in."
And we're not inferring anything, but this is just what you saw.
This is what,
This
you
is what I
experienced.
saw. And, we set up in his lounge room, as you can see. We shot him. He lived in an amazing verdant near a forest, and it was all kind of enclosed and, like that. Now, we shot the first interview. It was actually a disaster because he had smoked way too much weed. He was off point. He was all over the shop. I was trying to guide him back to facts, and he was very loosey-goosey. And we came away from that shoot going, "Oh my God, how are we going to make something coherent out of this?" Now, as the fate had it, we went that night down into Auckland City, and we went to get literally stopped to get like a quick bite to eat. And as we were unloading our camera gear, we must have been turned for 30 seconds or something, but our gear was stolen with all the tapes of that interview.
Wow.
And the funniest thing was that we spent the whole night going around to pubs in Auckland where they thought it'd be sort of like being sold on, So we're in all these kind of classic Maori pubs, and hey, what do you want, bro? And I said, we're looking for this video camera and some tapes. And oh no, mate, we don't do that stuff here. You got a VHS player, that's better, And so we had a really funny night trying to chase.
Do you suspect that it was just a momentary grab? It wasn't anything around Bruce's.
Well, look, I mean, you can see. I mean, okay, so that's the funny thing about this world. Once you step into this world, everything seems slightly skew-if. So that was odd. I mean, it just to put some gear down, literally. And when we're obviously traveling around the world doing this stuff, so it's not something that would be. And to be honest, Auckland, it's not a crime-ridden city, believe me.
But when it comes to Bruce De Palma, I mean, Bruce, it sounds to me as if Bruce must have still had some money.
Oh, yeah. But the place was reasonably decked out. Now, what that meant was we had to come back, find new gear, get some stock and go back and do it all again. And the second time was better. And obviously he's quite clear, although still a little stoned. He was much better. And so, in fact, doing it all again was actually worth it because I think the material would have been pretty unusable in a lot of ways because you'd be cutting around.
And it is such a remarkable story. And as I said, it is the one story. Not even the Bob Lazar story has gone out there and been bootlegged like this story has been. And so it's the one story people are really fascinated with. And just about every line in that is priceless and poetic. Can you tell us about what he said about the Noetics Institute that Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut, I'd like you to make this stay.
Well, it was just that because I actually didn't know about so the Noetics Institute, a research institute, was, according to Bruce, a CIA front for attracting, alternative inventors and trying to lure people such as himself who were, creating devices and technology that would be, well, a threat to corporate sort of interest, I think, is the way he phrased it. And Edgar Mitchell, who was as you've rightly pointed out, a former NASA astronaut, was his liaison, was the person that he was kind of dealing with. But when he finally met with Mitchell, and I think they made an offer to him to buy the patent for the N machine, the technology that he was working with, I think from memory, Bruce declined, obviously, for all sorts of reasons. But then the threat started. And that's where basically, as Bruce says in the interview, that Edgar Mitchell had said to him, we can we can kill you at any time, basically,
No.
you know. And so basically, hand the frickin' technology over, or we'll blow you up. And
Wow.
that's why, according to Bruce, that's why he left the US very, very quickly.
Right.
And surrounded himself with all these interns.
Well, I thought they were a bit like fembots from a kind of
What was he
Austin
like
Powers
to deal
movie.
with as a person? How did you find him?
I found
Stoned
him
and drunk.
a little bit. He was. I mean, it might sound really odd because obviously, for me, I was kind of fascinated because
Yeah,
coming
he's
from
a
a
fascinating
filmmaking,
story.
Yeah.
coming from a filmmaking point of view, I loved Brian De Palma's work, and I was kind of interested about their relationship, and
Yeah.
and so obviously it was really interesting for me off camera to try and sort of just talk a little bit about.
Did he
But
say anything to you about his brother and the relationship at all?
he was incredibly he was circuitous around it. He kind of didn't want to go into it. And I had this weird feeling that there was a huge fallout between them. I mean, that's the only thing. I'm sort of plucking things out of the air based on what he's saying or not saying.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed like they had not had contact for years. And
Right.
it's ironic. But when you hear Brian De Palma talk about his brother, certainly when they were young boys and young guys growing up, I think they were really competitive, and they were really both
Very
reasonably
bright.
inspired, very bright, very inspired by each other, and very ambitious, both of them. And
Wow.
but I suspect something happened between them, and it was like almost felt like it was a no-go zone. Yeah.
Did you like Bruce?
Yeah, I did. I found him. Look, this might sound
About
really
4
odd.
minutes, people.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'll wrap this up pretty quickly. But he was a bit like, and don't take this in the wrong way. He was a bit like that kind of really smart but sleazy uncle you have at a sort of
That fascinates you.
you know he's a bit sort of a bit wrong.
The creepy
You
uncle.
don't want to be left overnight with him, but it's great for an evening.
You don't want to do a sleepover with old uncle.
Yeah.
Look, there are so many other fascinating people. Is there anything you want to tell us that might be a hot, juicy bit? Because we are getting up in time, and this interview's gone so long, but there's so much to talk about.
Oh God,
anything else that comes to mind in the midst of it?
Oh God, it's such it's quite long ago. I don't know. I mean, for me, okay. Here's one thing. This is actually really interesting. I'll do it as quickly as I can. Basically, we were trying to set up an interview at Nellis Air Force Base, and we, as part of our whole Area 51 story, and we wanted, someone that could, from the military, from the Air Force, that could kind of give us a bit of, official background, if you will. And we had this liaison with this general, and we were really pleased. We'd set up. We'd actually booked in their time. We were going to go to Nellis Air Force Base and shoot it. And we had it all in our schedule. We got there. And then as you do, you call the day before just to lock in, make sure everything's okay. And I can't believe I got the famous, we don't know of this, we have never heard of this person before. We said, but hang on, I'll make up a name. It's General MacArthur. We booked him in for 2 p.m. tomorrow. And he said no, there's no one of that name at this facility whatsoever. And I just thought, you're kidding me. This is like straight out of
Cloak and
the
Dagger.
The X-Files.
Exactly. And I needed to talk to Scully about this, I mean, it was
That's
ridiculous.
extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
Yeah. And I knew I was stepping into a world it was real,
Yeah.
So if people want to see this doco, have you got it privately on your Vimeo?
I mean,
okay.
So what happened?
We need to work out rights and see that. So as I said before, you can go up on YouTube. There was a British series that came out not long after it that mimicked a lot of the titling and the way that the structure. And and so it was a show that never got the proper viewing distribution to the markets. It would have taken off big time. We both realized that.
Yeah, it would have been
and when it screened in Australia on prime time, it rated its socks off.
It did. It was shown on a Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. and it rated through the roof. And in every capital city in Australia. And the only reason it didn't go into proper series was because the Channel 10 management had a huge takeover, and the new management came in and just wiped the previous management's slate of projects. And
Yes, they do.
and,
Yeah, right.
that was it.
Yep.
Now,
Or was it?
you are an incredible independent director. That would have been a
Got a
great
couple of
line to end,
minutes.
or was it? Now, we've only got a few minutes, so
No,
we've
we've got to go.
going to come up to the ending, and we want to thank you so much. How do people get in touch with you, Brendan, if they want to talk about this and your future projects, including your incredible genre film, The Widow?
Well, yes, that's a whole other story. No, look, I think you can just find me on Facebook, and you can Facebook message me, Brendan Young, Mondo Moviola, if they want to, or Mondo. I think it's Mondo Brendo. I can't remember, but I'm pretty easily found on Facebook. You can do a Facebook message or something. That's the easiest way to do it.
Okay.
Well,
Can
we
do.
have to thank you so much. You've been on Untold Radio. This is Down South Anomalies with Jay Katz and Aspasia, and our gracious man behind the curtain, giving us a peek behind so many characters in 20th century and 21st century ufology, the director, Brendan Young.
We'll be back next week with another interesting show. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.